The laundromat on 7th Street wasn't haunted in the traditional sense. There were no rattling chains or ghostly moans. Instead, it hummed with an electricity that seemed a little too eager, as if the fluorescent lights and ancient washers knew more than they let on. Mira didn't believe in haunted places, which was why she was sitting there at midnight with a pile of clothes that smelled like regret and secondhand smoke. The 24-hour laundromat had been her sanctuary for years, a place where no one asked questions and the world felt distant. Tonight, it was quieter than usual. Too quiet. The first sign that something was wrong came from the vending machine. Mira had fed it $1 for a bag of pretzels, but instead of dispensing her snack, the machine whirred violently before spitting out a small, rolled-up piece of paper. She frowned, leaning down to pick it up. The paper felt odd, too heavy for its size, and when she unrolled it, the message inside was written in a language she didn't recognize. The letters looked ancient, angular, and sharp, like they had been etched by claws instead of pins. She turned it over, half expecting some prankster's punchline, but the other side was blank. That's when she noticed the faint smell of ozone, like the air after a lightning strike. Her instinct screamed at her to leave, but she hesitated. She wasn't the kind of person who ran from weirdness. If anything, she usually ran toward it. The second sign came from the dryers. Mira had loaded one with her clothes and turned away for only a moment. When she glanced back, the dryer window was pitch black, as if someone had filled it with ink. She walked closer, squinting, and realized it wasn't black. Something was moving inside, shifting and rippling like water under a cloudy sky. She reached out to stop the machine, but before her hand touched the controls, the blackness vanished, replaced by the sight of her clothes tumbling as usual. Mira stepped back, her heart pounding. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe she was overtired. She told herself this as she returned to her seat, but the laundromat no longer felt like a sanctuary. The third sign was impossible to ignore. The door to the laundromat swung open, though no one walked in. A cold wind swept through, carrying with it the faint sound of whispers. Mira turned toward the entrance, expecting to see some late-night straggler fumbling with their laundry basket, but the street outside was empty. The whispers grew louder, weaving through the hum of the machines, and she realized they weren't coming from outside. They were coming from the washers. She stood slowly, her legs stiff with fear. The machines were no longer washing clothes. The windows of each washer and dryer were filled with scenes, places she had never been, faces she didn't recognize, all moving like tiny films playing in loops. One washer showed a forest with trees that shimmered like silver. Another displayed a vast, crumbling city where the streets crawled with shadowy figures. A dryer revealed a man sitting alone in a room, his back to the viewer, his shoulders shaking as if he were crying. Myra's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. She closed her eyes, counting to 10, but when she opened them, the scenes were still there. The whispers grew louder, forming words she could almost understand. One voice rose above the rest, clear and sharp, cutting through the din. Mira. Her name. It came from the machine directly in front of her, one of the older washers with rust creeping up its sides. She stepped closer, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch the glass. Inside, the scene shifted to show a room she recognized immediately, her apartment. She saw herself sitting on her couch, staring blankly at the television. But something was wrong. The Mira in the washer wasn't moving, wasn't breathing. She was frozen, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. Mira. The voice came again, louder this time, and she stumbled back, her heart racing. "What do you want?" she whispered, her voice cracking. The washer didn't answer. Instead, the scene inside it dissolved into a swirling void, dark and endless. Mira felt a pull, a magnetic force drawing her closer to the machine. She tried to resist, but her feet betrayed her, moving forward as if controlled by someone else. The void expanded, spilling out of the washer and into the laundromat. The fluorescent lights flickered and buzzed, the air thickening with that same ozone smell. The whispers returned, now frantic, overlapping and crashing into one another like waves in a storm. "Mira," the voice said again, and this time, It came from everywhere. The darkness reached her feet, curling around her like smoke. She struggled, but it was no use. The void climbed higher, wrapping around her legs, her torso, her arms. Just before it swallowed her completely, she heard one final whisper. "You're the key." Then everything went black. Mira woke up on a cold, metallic floor, the taste of copper on her tongue. She sat up slowly, her head pounding, and looked around. She was no longer in the laundromat. The room was vast and alien, its walls made of shifting light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Symbols like the ones from the vending machine paper floated in the air, spinning lazily before disappearing into the walls. In the center of the room stood a figure cloaked in shadows, their face obscured but their presence undeniable. "Welcome," the figure said, their voice the same one that had called her name. "You have been chosen." "Chosen for what?" Mira asked, her voice steadier than she felt. The figure stepped closer, and the symbols around them flared brighter. "To rewrite the rules." Mira stared at them, her mind racing. She thought of the washer, the whispers, the impossible scenes. "What are you talking about? Rewrite what rules?" The figure extended a hand, and in it was the same piece of paper she had pulled from the vending machine. Only now, the symbols on it were glowing. "The rules of reality," the figure said. "They've been unraveling, and we need you to put them back together." Mira wanted to laugh, to scream, to run. But something deep inside her stirred, a feeling she couldn't explain, like she had been waiting for this moment her entire life. She reached out, her fingers brushing the glowing paper, and the world shifted again. This time, Mira didn't resist. The carnival appeared overnight, sprawling across the empty lot like a forgotten memory suddenly returned. No one had seen trucks. No one heard the clang of metal scaffolding or the hum of engines setting it up. It was simply there at dawn, a riot of color against the gray sky. I spotted it from my apartment window, the striped tents and looping roller coaster tracks standing where nothing but weeds had been the day before. A sign at the gate read, "The Carnival of Lost Moments." Beneath it, in smaller print, were the words, "One visit only." I told myself I wouldn't go. Something about it felt off, as though the whole scene was too perfect, too surreal to trust. But the day dragged on, and by dusk, the bright lights spilling across the streets were impossible to ignore. I wandered toward the gate, hands shoved deep in my jacket pockets, telling myself I was just going to look. The woman at the entrance didn't ask for a ticket. She smiled, wide and knowing, as though she'd been expecting me. "You'll find what you're looking for," she said, stepping aside to let me through. "But only what you've forgotten." The words stayed with me as I walked through the carnival. It wasn't like other fairs I'd been to. The Ferris wheel moved silently, its spokes glinting like silver in the starlight. The carousel spun lazily, the painted horses frozen in expressions of terror, not joy. And the smells, cotton candy and popcorn, lingered just long enough to remind you of something sweet before they disappeared altogether. I wandered deeper, drawn by a faint melody. It sounded like a music box, its tune half familiar and achingly sad. I followed it to a tent draped in black velvet. A sign above the entrance read, "The Hall of Forgotten Choices." Inside, it was cold, the air thick with the scent of old wood and dust. A single spotlight illuminated a series of mirrors, each one different. Some were cracked, others clouded. When I looked into the first mirror, I saw myself as a teenager, standing outside a bookstore. My reflection held a slip of paper with a phone number scrawled on it, a memory I hadn't thought about in years. I'd been too shy to call the number, and the boy who'd given it to me had eventually faded from my life. The mirror shimmered, and the memory dissolved, leaving only my reflection. I moved to the next mirror. This one showed me at a crossroads, literally. Two paths stretched out before me, one leading to a city, the other into a dense forest. I remembered the day clearly, the offer of a job far from home, a chance to leave everything behind. In the mirror, I watched myself hesitate before turning toward the forest. I hadn't taken the job, had I? But the scene changed, showing a version of my life where I had. There I was, in a sleek office, laughing with strangers who felt like friends. The reflection smiled at me before fading, leaving me with the unsettling feeling that both paths were true. I couldn't bear to look into another mirror. I stumbled out of the tent, the music box tune still playing faintly behind me. The carnival seemed larger now, the pathways twisting and branching in impossible ways. I passed a food stall where the vendor offered me a caramel apple, his grin too wide. "It tastes like a summer you've forgotten," he said. I didn't take it. The next tent was impossible to ignore. Its entrance was a gaping mouth, rows of jagged teeth painted along the fabric edges. A sign hanging above it read, "The Ride of Regrets." Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The floor tilted sharply downward, leading to a single cart perched on rusty tracks. I climbed in, my heart hammering as the cart jerked forward. The ride was slow at first, winding through a tunnel of dim light and faint whispers. The whispers grew louder, resolving into words. "Why didn't you stay?" one voice asked. "You could have saved her," another said. Faces flickered in the darkness, people I hadn't thought of in years. Old friends, lost loves, a neighbor I hadn't visited before he passed. Each one stared at me, their eyes full of questions I couldn't answer. The cart jerked to a stop, and I stumbled out into the open air. My legs felt weak, my chest tight. The carnival seemed alive now, the rides groaning and creaking, the lights flickering like they were breathing. I wanted to leave, but the path back to the entrance was gone. The next tent wasn't a tent at all, but a door standing upright in the middle of the path. It was painted red, with a brass handle that gleamed like it had been polished moments ago. There was no sign, no clue as to what lay beyond it. I hesitated, then turned the handle. I was in my childhood bedroom. The walls were the same pale yellow, the furniture exactly as I remembered. A pile of stuffed animals sat on the bed, their glass eyes glinting in the moonlight streaming through the window. At the desk, a younger version of myself was writing in a journal, her brow furrowed in concentration. She looked up when she saw me and smiled. "You forgot about me," she said. Her voice was soft but firm, the way I used to sound before the world taught me to doubt myself. "But I didn't forget you." I didn't know what to say. She stood, crossing the room to stand in front of me. She was smaller than I remembered, her eyes wide and clear. "Do you remember what you wanted?" she asked. I shook my head, tears pricking at my eyes. She reached out, pressing something into my hand. When I looked down, it was a tiny paper crane. "Find me again," she said, her voice fading as the room dissolved around me. I was back in the carnival, the paper crane still in my hand. The air felt heavier now, the lights dimmer. I stumbled toward the entrance, desperate to leave. The woman at the gate was waiting, her knowing smile unchanged. "Did you find what you'd forgotten?" she asked. I nodded, though I wasn't sure what I'd found. She stepped aside, letting me pass. As I walked away, the carnival behind me vanished, leaving only the empty lot and a faint, lingering scent of cotton candy. I held the paper crane tightly, feeling its edges bite into my palm. It was the only proof that any of it had been real. I always knew Eddie was a little weird, but I didn't know how weird until the freezer incident. Eddie moved in 2 months ago, taking the spare room after my last roommate bailed to live with their boyfriend. At first, he seemed fine, quiet, punctual with rent, and surprisingly good at making lasagna. We didn't have much in common. He worked nights at a data center, and I was a daytime graphic designer. But that was fine. I liked the quiet, or so I thought. The first red flag was the freezer. One day, I came home to find it padlocked shut. Not a flimsy combination lock, either. A massive industrial-grade lock that looked like it belonged on the gates of a fortress. I stared at it for a long time, then opened the fridge. My milk and eggs were still there, along with the leftover Chinese takeout I'd been meaning to finish. Only the freezer was sealed off, its contents inaccessible. When Eddie came home that night, I brought it up. "Hey, why's the freezer locked?" He didn't even blink. "Oh, that. I'm storing something sensitive for work. Don't worry about it." "Storing what, exactly?" "Just some samples. Nothing dangerous." He brushed past me, carrying a paper bag that I swore smelled faintly of ammonia, and disappeared into his room. I stood there, trying to decide if that was a normal thing for a person to say, but eventually, I shrugged it off. I didn't use the freezer much anyway. A week later, the smell started. It was faint at first, like someone had left a wet sponge under the sink. I searched the kitchen, sniffing around like a bloodhound, but couldn't find the source. By the second day, it was stronger, sour and metallic, like rotting meat. I texted Eddie, "Hey, is the freezer thing leaking? Smells weird." He didn't respond. That night, when he got home, I confronted him in person. He looked genuinely surprised. "You smell something?" "Huh, I'll check it out." But he didn't. The padlock stayed on the freezer, and the smell got worse. It started creeping into the rest of the apartment, invading my room and clinging to my clothes. I lit every candle I owned, sprayed Febreze until my finger hurt, and even borrowed an air purifier from a friend, but nothing worked. I considered cutting the padlock off myself, but I didn't want to deal with Eddie's reaction. Instead, I tried to avoid the kitchen entirely, living off granola bars and coffee I bought on the way to work. Then the noises started. It was subtle at first, a faint hum, like an old fridge compressor. But late at night, when the apartment was silent, I started hearing other things. Soft thumps, like something shifting inside the freezer. Once, I thought I heard scratching, but I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I finally decided to press Eddie about it. I waited until Saturday morning, when I knew he'd be awake, and cornered him in the living room. "Okay, seriously, what's in the freezer?" He looked up from his laptop, his expression calm but unreadable. "I told you. Samples." "Samples of what?" He hesitated, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Unease, maybe. "Look, it's nothing illegal, if that's what you're worried about." "That's exactly what I'm worried about, Eddie. The place smells like something died in there." His jaw tightened. "It's complicated." "Complicated how?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stood up, grabbed his keys, and left the apartment. I stood there, stunned, then went into his room. I didn't feel guilty. Okay, maybe a little, but my curiosity outweighed my ethics. His room was surprisingly neat, except for his desk, which was covered in printouts of diagrams and notes written in tiny, meticulous handwriting. Most of it didn't make sense, something about cellular regeneration and thermal containment, but one phrase stood out: keep below -50 degrees Celsius at all times. I backed out of the room, my heart pounding. That night, the noises got louder. The thumping became rhythmic, almost like breathing. I barely slept, and when I did, I dreamed of the freezer, its padlock replaced with a gaping, toothy maw. I woke up drenched in sweat, the smell in the air so strong it felt like it was seeping into my skin. By morning, I'd had enough. Eddie wasn't home, so I grabbed a hammer and a screwdriver and went to work on the padlock. It took longer than I expected. Eddie hadn't skimped on security, but eventually, the lock snapped open. I yanked the freezer door open, ready to face whatever horror lay inside. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. There were jars, dozens of them, lined up neatly like some twisted collection. Each one was filled with a murky liquid, and suspended inside were things. I leaned closer, my stomach churning. One jar contained what looked like a lizard, except its eyes were on stalks, and its tail split into 3 writhing ends. Another held something vaguely human, though its skin was translucent, revealing a web of pulsing veins beneath. And in the largest jar, crammed into the back of the freezer, was something alive. It pressed its face, or what I assumed was its face, against the glass, its many eyes blinking slowly. Its limbs twitched, long and spindly, like a spider's, but it had hands, 6 of them, pressed flat against the jar as if pleading. My brain screamed at me to shut the door, to run, to burn the apartment down if I had to, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, frozen, as it opened its mouth and made a sound. A low, mournful wail that made my teeth ache. "Don't touch it." I whipped around to see Eddie standing in the doorway, his face pale but calm. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "It's research," he said, stepping closer. "I didn't want to involve you, but this is insane. You have a freaking alien in our freezer." It's not an alien, he said, almost offensively. It's a prototype. A prototype for what? He hesitated, then sighed. I can explain, but you're not going to like it. I didn't like it. Eddie was, apparently, part of some off-the-books project involving genetic engineering and cryonic preservation. He wasn't supposed to bring his work home, but something had gone wrong at the lab, and he'd panicked. It's not dangerous, he insisted, as long as it stays frozen. Yeah, well, it doesn't smell not dangerous. That's a side effect, he admitted. I'll move it. I promise. I wanted to kick him out right then and there, but I didn't. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was the look on his face. Genuine guilt, like he knew he'd crossed a line. He kept his promise, though. By the next day, the freezer was empty, the padlock gone. The smell lingered for a while, but eventually, it faded, leaving me to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. Eddie moved out a week later, leaving nothing behind except a note on the fridge. Sorry for the trouble. Keep the lasagna recipe. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear scratching coming from the walls, and I wonder if Eddie really took everything with him. But I don't check. I don't want to know. AITA? The morning began like any other, with the sun leaking through my blinds and the sound of the neighbor's dog barking at absolutely nothing. I was halfway through a cup of coffee that was more sludge than liquid when the letter slid under my door. It wasn't the typical junk mail or a bill. I could tell from the weight of the envelope, the rich cream-colored paper, and the seal pressed into the back, an emblem I didn't recognize. Curious, I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of thick parchment with a handwritten note in elegant cursive. Congratulations, you have been selected as this year's seeker. Your first task awaits at the old carousel in Bellamy Park. Midnight. No signature. No explanation. Just an invitation to what sounded like a scavenger hunt. I almost laughed and tossed it into the trash, but something about it stopped me. Maybe it was the way my name was written at the top. Exactly the way my grandmother used to write it, with the loops on the G and Y exaggerated like tiny flourishes of joy. By midnight, I found myself at Bellamy Park, standing before the carousel that hadn't spun in years. The horses were faded, their paint chipped, but they seemed to glow faintly under the moonlight. The air was still, charged with the kind of anticipation you feel before a storm. You're late, a voice said, startling me. I turned to find a man leaning against one of the carousel poles. He was tall and thin, with a face that seemed to shift in the shadows. Handsome one moment, unsettling the next. His clothes were outdated but pristine, like he'd stepped out of an old photograph. Who are you? I asked, my voice trembling. He smiled, revealing teeth that were just a little too sharp. Your guide. Call me Mr. Finch. Shall we begin? Begin what? Instead of answering, he handed me a small, silver key. It was cold in my hand, its surface engraved with a pattern of stars. Turn the carousel, he said, gesturing to the central lever. I don't think it works anymore, I replied, but he gave me a look that brooked no argument. Hesitant, I inserted the key into a slot I hadn't noticed before and turned it. The carousel groaned to life, the creak of its mechanisms mingling with the faint notes of a warped calliope tune. As the carousel spun, the world around us seemed to blur. The park, the trees, the sky, all of it melted away like wet paint. When the carousel stopped, we were somewhere else entirely. The air was thick with the scent of sea salt and rust. Around us stretched a vast, decrepit pier jutting out over black, motionless water. The sky above was a deep, bruised purple, devoid of stars. Strange, angular shadows moved at the edges of my vision, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Where are we? I whispered. Somewhere in between, Mr. Finch said. Your first task is simple. Retrieve the box. I followed his gaze to the end of the pier, where a small wooden box sat on a pedestal. It didn't seem far, but the air felt heavier with each step, like I was wading through invisible currents. The shadows at the edge of my vision grew darker, closer. When I reached the box, it was smaller than I expected, about the size of a jewelry case. Its surface was plain, save for a single word carved into the lid. Remember. I reached out, but the moment my fingers brushed the box, the shadows surged. They weren't shadows at all but figures, tall and spindly, their limbs bending at impossible angles. Their faces were featureless, yet I could feel their gaze piercing through me. "Run!" Mr. Finch's voice cut through the rising panic. I grabbed the box and sprinted back toward the carousel. The figures moved faster than should have been possible, their bodies flickering like bad television reception. Just as one of them reached for me, its long fingers brushing the back of my neck, Mr. Finch yanked me onto the carousel and turned the key. The world blurred again, the figures dissolving into streaks of black. When the carousel stopped, we were back in Bellamy Park. My heart hammered in my chest as I clutched the box, my breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. "Well done," Mr. Finch said, his tone annoyingly casual for someone who hadn't just been chased by nightmare creatures. "What the hell was that?" I demanded. He shrugged. "Regrets. Manifestations of what you've tried to forget." I stared at the box in my hands, its weight suddenly unbearable. "And what's in here?" "Open it and see." I hesitated. Part of me didn't want to know, but I couldn't walk away without understanding. Slowly, I lifted the lid. Inside was a single photograph. It was of me as a child, sitting beside a woman I didn't recognize. She had kind eyes and a sad smile, her hand resting gently on my shoulder. On the back of the photograph were the words, "You promised you wouldn't forget." I felt a jolt, like something breaking loose inside me. Memories flooded back, of laughter, of lullabies sung in a soft, lilting voice, of a woman who had been everything to me until she was gone. My mother. The one I'd buried so deeply in my mind that I'd convinced myself she'd never existed. Tears blurred my vision as I clutched the photograph. "Why did you bring me here?" I asked, my voice trembling. "To remember," Mr. Finch said, his voice gentler now, "and to decide what to do with the truth." The carousel creaked behind me, its horses frozen mid-gallop, their chipped faces strangely serene. In that moment, I understood. The box, the shadows, the photograph, it was all a test. A chance to confront the pieces of myself I tried to erase. When I looked up, Mr. Finch was gone, and the park was quiet again. The carousel stood still, its key missing. In my hand, the photograph felt warm, as though it carried not just memories, but something else, something like hope. I walked away from the park, the weight of the past no longer crushing, but something I could carry. My brother Will is the kind of person who walks through life like he's carrying a map no one else can see. He's eccentric, brilliant, and maddeningly impulsive, the type of guy who'll text you at 2 a.m. with ideas like, "Let's bike across Iceland," or "What if we started a kombucha empire?" But 6 months ago, he hit a wall. His startup failed spectacularly, some app involving astrology and cryptocurrency that even I, his biggest fan, couldn't fully understand. He poured everything into it. His savings, his reputation, his sense of self. When it crashed, so did he. Will didn't just lose his company, he lost his spark. He stopped inventing, stopped dreaming, stopped being Will. He moved back into his old apartment, where the echoes of his former life seemed to suffocate him. Every time I visited, I'd find him sitting on the couch, scrolling his phone like a zombie, surrounded by cardboard boxes he hadn't bothered to unpack. One night, after yet another awkward attempt to cheer him up over takeout, I had an idea. It wasn't the kind of idea Will would have had. It didn't involve blockchain or global markets, but it was uniquely mine. Will's always loved mazes. As a kid, he could get lost in a hedge maze for hours, not to escape but to explore, to map it in his mind. When he wasn't designing imaginary treasure maps, he was convincing me to crawl through cardboard labyrinths he built in the living room. Mazes were his thing. So, I decided to build him one. The idea started small, maybe something cute in the backyard, but it quickly spiraled. If I was going to do this, I had to go big. I spent weeks sketching out plans, scouring online forums for ideas, and watching every YouTube video on DIY maze building I could find. I borrowed tools from neighbors, bought materials on clearance, and raided my dad's workshop for anything remotely useful. The result was ambitious. I built the maze in an abandoned lot behind an old industrial building near my neighborhood. It wasn't just any maze. It was a living scrapbook of Will's life. Every twist and turn was packed with memories and inside jokes. Walls covered in photos from our childhood. Secret doors that opened to reveal old drawings of his. Riddles about the ridiculous ideas he'd once pitched me. I even rigged up little puzzles he'd have to solve to move forward. Simple circuits he'd recognized from our late-night science experiments as kids. The centerpiece of the maze was something I called the memory vault. It was a small room hidden deep within, filled with mementos from his life. His first business card, the sketchbook he used to carry everywhere, and a video I recorded of family and friends telling him how much we believed in him. The whole thing was a tribute to who Will had always been. A reminder that failure didn't erase everything he'd achieved, or the person he still was. The hardest part wasn't building the maze. It was convincing him to show up. I told him it was a surprise, something I'd been working on to celebrate him. He resisted at first, claiming he wasn't in the mood for whatever weirdness I'd cooked up, but eventually, I wore him down. On the big day, I led him blindfolded to the maze's entrance. When I pulled the blindfold off, his jaw dropped. What is this?" he asked, his eyes darting over the towering plywood walls and the bright banners I'd strung across the entrance. "It's your maze," I said, grinning. "Your whole life, one path at a time. Come on." He looked skeptical but curious. That was good enough for me. Watching him navigate the maze was a roller coaster. At first, he was awkward and hesitant, like he didn't know how to let himself enjoy it. But as he solved the puzzles and uncovered the clues, I saw the old Will start to re-emerge. He laughed at the jokes I'd plastered on the walls, muttered complaints when he hit dead ends, and even started running at one point, chasing the next clue with a determination I hadn't seen in months. When he finally reached the memory vault, he froze. I watched from a hidden corner as he opened the door, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to something softer, almost reverent. He lingered over the mementos, tracing his fingers over the edges of his old sketchbook, and when the video played, he actually sat down to watch it. At one point, I saw him wipe his eyes, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. When he emerged from the maze, his face was red, his hair a mess, and his grin so wide it practically split his face. "You did all this?" he asked, his voice cracking. "For you," I said simply. For a moment, I thought he might cry again, but instead, he pulled me into a hug so tight it hurt. "You're insane," he said, laughing. "But thank you. I didn't know I needed this." In the weeks that followed, something shifted in Will. He wasn't back to his old self overnight, but the maze seemed to spark something in him, like a door cracking open. He started sketching again, scribbling on napkins and posts like he used to. He called old friends, reconnected with people he'd lost touch with. He even pitched a new business idea to me over coffee. Not one I understood, but that wasn't the point. The maze didn't fix everything, but it reminded him that life was still a puzzle worth solving. And as I watched him walk out of that maze, lighter and more alive than I'd seen him in months, I realized it had done the same for me. I was halfway through deconstructing a clock when my phone buzzed. The clock wasn't broken. I just wanted to see how it worked. On a good day, this was a harmless quirk. On a bad day, it was an obsession that left my apartment looking like a junkyard of half-assembled objects. Today was somewhere in between. I ignored the phone for a moment, trying to figure out how the tiny gears fit together, but it buzzed again. Then again. By the fourth buzz, I set the screwdriver down and checked the screen. It was my mother. She never texted unless it was urgent. The woman still believed emojis were a passing fad, and the fact that she had learned to text at all was a miracle of the digital age. Her message was short, which meant it was serious. "We need to talk. Call me ASAP." My stomach flipped as I dialed her number. She answered on the first ring, skipping all pleasantries. "Elliot, I need your help." Her tone was flat, businesslike, and slightly ominous, as though she were about to draft me into some covert mission. "What's going on?" I asked, bracing myself. She didn't often ask for favors, but when she did, they were monumental. "It's your sister, Clara. She's in trouble." That wasn't surprising. Clara had a knack for finding trouble, whether it was getting into arguments with strangers on the subway or dragging me into her ill-advised schemes. But my mother's voice carried a weight that suggested this wasn't just another one of Clara's antics. She's moving back into the house, my mother said. Temporarily. She says it's just for a few months while she gets back on her feet. But I don't think I can handle her alone. I felt a pang of guilt. I lived 2 states away, far enough to avoid the daily dramas, but close enough to feel obligated when things fell apart. What do you want me to do? I asked cautiously. I need you to come home for a little while, she said. Just until we figure things out. Home. The word sat heavy in my chest. I hadn't been back in years. Not since Dad died. Not since the house had become less of a home and more of a mausoleum, filled with the echoes of everything we'd lost. I don't know if I can, I said, my voice hesitant. Work is crazy and… Elliot, she interrupted, her tone sharp. I'm not asking. Your sister needs you. I need you. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. Okay, I said finally. I'll come. The drive was long and uneventful, the kind that left too much room for thinking. I tried not to dwell on what I might find when I got there, but my mind kept drifting to Clara. The last time we'd spoken, it had ended in a screaming match over something I couldn't even remember. She was a whirlwind, all sharp edges and untamed energy, and being around her was like standing too close to a bonfire. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked smaller than I remembered. The once pristine lawn was overgrown, and the shutters hung crooked, as if the house itself had given up. My mother greeted me at the door, her face lined with exhaustion. She hugged me briefly, then stepped back, her hands on her hips. She's in the basement, she said, as if that explained everything. The basement had always been Clara's domain, a chaotic mix of art supplies, half-finished projects, and the occasional feral idea she brought to life. When I opened the door, the smell of paint and sawdust hit me like a wave. Clara was hunched over a canvas, her hair tied up in a messy bun, her hands streaked with color. She didn't look up when I entered. Hey, I said cautiously. She glanced at me, her expression unreadable. Elliot, didn't know you were coming. Mom asked me to, I said. She snorted. Of course she did. Can't fight her own battles. I bit back a retort and sat down on a nearby stool. So, what's going on? She didn't answer immediately, instead smearing a streak of crimson across the canvas with her thumb. Got laid off, she said finally. Rent went up. Couldn't keep up. It's temporary. Just until I figure things out. I nodded, unsure what to say. Clara had always lived on the edge, juggling jobs and dreams, never quite settling into the structure of adulthood. Mom's worried about you, I said carefully. She's worried about the house, Clara shot back. She thinks I'll ruin it. Like I'm some kind of wild animal. Aren't you? I said before I could stop myself. She laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. Fair point. For the next few days, I tried to find a rhythm in the chaos. Clara's presence was like a hurricane, leaving messes in her wake and tensions simmering just below the surface. My mother oscillated between passive-aggressive comments and outright arguments, while I played mediator, trying to keep the peace. One night, after a particularly heated argument over whether Clara could paint a mural on the dining room wall, I found her sitting on the porch, smoking a cigarette. You don't even smoke, I said, sitting next to her. Tonight I do, she said, exhaling a plume of smoke into the night air. We sat in silence for a while, the sound of crickets filling the space between us. Finally, she spoke. You know, I didn't want to come back here. This place feels like a prison. It's not a prison, I said. It's just unfinished. She glanced at me, her eyes sharp. Unfinished, huh? Like me? That's not what I meant, I said quickly. I just mean there's a lot of history here. It's heavy. She nodded, her expression softening. Yeah, it is. The next morning, I woke to find her painting the mural she and Mom had fought over. She didn't ask for permission, just started working, her movements deliberate and focused. By the time my mother saw it, it was too late to stop her. To everyone's surprise, the mural was beautiful, a swirling, chaotic mix of colors and shapes that somehow felt like home. My mother didn't say anything at first, just stood there staring at it. Then she sighed and walked away, leaving Clara grinning triumphantly. In the days that followed, something shifted. The fights grew less frequent, the silences less tense. Clara started picking up after herself, and my mother stopped hovering. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. When the time came for me to leave, I hugged Clara tightly, the smell of paint and smoke clinging to her clothes. "You'll be okay," I said. "Yeah," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I think I will." Driving away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, the house growing smaller in the distance. It still looked a little crooked, a little tired, but the mural in the dining room gave it life, gave it hope. Maybe Clara wasn't the only one unfinished. Maybe we all were. AITA for leaving when they still needed me? Or was it okay to trust they'd figure it out without me? It started at a garage sale. Not one of those suburban driveways piled with old baby clothes and scratched DVDs, but a sprawling, chaotic affair on the edge of town. The kind of sale where the tables sag under the weight of mismatched antiques, broken typewriters, and unsettling porcelain dolls with cloudy eyes. I wasn't even looking for anything. I was just killing time on a Sunday morning, wandering between rows of junk when I saw it. It was an old compass, small enough to fit in the palm of my hand. The brass casing was tarnished, the glass cracked, but the needle inside spun erratically, as if it had forgotten how compasses were supposed to work. The man running the sale, an older guy with a scraggly beard and a face like weathered leather, grinned when he saw me pick it up. "Good eye," he said. "That's a special one." "How much?" I asked, already preparing to haggle. He shook his head. "Not for sale," he said. "Not exactly, but I'll trade you for it." I raised an eyebrow. "Trade for what?" "Something you'll miss," he said cryptically, and before I could think it through, I blurted out, "Fine." I didn't even realize what I'd agreed to until he pressed the compass into my hand, his grin widening. "Happy travels." I left feeling unsettled, but not enough to turn around. By the time I got home, the encounter was already fading into the background noise of my weekend. That was my first mistake. My second was opening the compass. The needle didn't point north. It didn't point anywhere, at least not anywhere logical. Instead, it jerked violently toward the corner of my living room. I turned, and the needle followed, spinning wildly before locking onto my hallway. Curious, I followed it, moving through my apartment as the needle tugged me toward nothing. It stopped dead at my bedroom door, quivering slightly, as if daring me to open it. When I did, the room was empty. For a week, the compass sat on my nightstand, a bizarre but harmless trinket. Then the dreams started. They were vivid, more real than any dream had a right to be. In the first one, I was standing in the middle of an unfamiliar street. The buildings were impossibly tall, their windows glowing with a pale, pulsing light. The air smelled like burnt sugar, and the ground beneath my feet hummed softly, like a living thing. In the distance, something massive moved between the skyscrapers, too far away to see clearly but close enough to hear the low, rhythmic thrum of its footsteps. When I woke up, the compass was clutched in my hand, the needle trembling. Each night, the dreams grew stranger. A vast desert of shifting glass dunes, where the sky bled colors I couldn't name. An endless forest of trees with roots that whispered secrets in a language I almost understood. A colossal city built into the side of a cliff, its streets filled with faceless figures who turned to stare as I passed. Every morning, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all, the compass still in my hand. Then one day, it stopped being a dream. I was walking to the grocery store, the compass tucked into my jacket pocket, when the needle started spinning violently. I pulled it out, and it jerked toward a side street I'd never noticed before. I don't know why I followed it. Maybe I thought it would lead to some hidden corner of the city, a shortcut, or a secret park. What I found instead was a door. It was set into the side of an old brick building, unmarked and unassuming. The compass needle pointed directly at it, quivering with an almost frantic energy. I hesitated, then opened the door. The world on the other side wasn't mine. The sky was dark, not with night, but with something thick and swirling, like a storm that never broke. The air was heavy, filled with a low, droning hum that made my bones ache. The buildings were taller than anything I'd ever seen, their surfaces slick and black, reflecting distorted versions of me as I passed. The The streets were empty, but I could feel eyes watching from the shadows. The compass was warm in my hand, the needle pulling me forward. I wandered for hours, maybe days. Time didn't feel the same there. My phone was useless, the signal replaced by static and faint, unearthly whispers. The only thing that kept me moving was the compass, its needle leading me through labyrinthine alleys and over bridges that stretched into nothingness. Finally, I reached a massive archway carved from a single block of obsidian. The compass needle stopped spinning, pointing straight at the arch. I stepped through. There was a figure waiting for me on the other side. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body wrapped in a cloak that shimmered like oil on water. Its face, if it had one, was hidden beneath a hood. When it spoke, its voice was a chorus, 100 voices layered over one another. "You've come far," it said, "but the journey is not without cost." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaking. The figure extended a long, spindly hand and pointed at the compass. "You took this, and now you must give." "Give what?" I demanded, but I already knew the answer. The man at the garage sale had warned me. "Something you'll miss." Before I could protest, the figure reached out and touched my forehead with a single, icy finger. The world spun, and I blacked out. When I woke up, I was back in my apartment. The compass was gone, and for a moment, I thought it was over. Then I realized I couldn't remember my sister's name, or her face, or anything about her, except that she had existed once. The dreams are gone now, and I don't follow strange compasses anymore. But sometimes, late at night, I feel a pull, a faint tug in the back of my mind, as if something is calling me back. I wonder what else I'll lose if I answer. The first time Sam saw the shadow, he was sitting in his usual corner at Larkspur Coffee, sketching in his notebook. He liked the place because it was quiet, with just enough background chatter to keep him grounded. The barista, Danny, had just placed his usual, a black coffee with a shot of hazelnut, on the table when the shadow flickered at the edge of his vision. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, like a smudge on a window that vanished when you tried to focus on it. Sam glanced up, half expecting to see someone passing by the window, but the street outside was empty. Just as he was about to dismiss it, he noticed something strange. His reflection in the window was smiling. Sam wasn't smiling. He blinked hard, and when he looked again, his reflection matched his expression, confused, unsettled. Shaking it off as a trick of the light, he returned to his sketch. But the lines he'd been working on were no longer there. Instead, the page was filled with an intricate design he didn't remember drawing. A maze of twisting corridors, stairs that led nowhere, and doorways opening into darkness. He slammed the notebook shut, his pulse quickening. Maybe he was more tired than he thought. Maybe his hand had moved on its own while his mind wandered. But deep down, he knew that wasn't it. The next few days passed uneventfully. Sam tried to push the incident out of his mind, chalking it up to stress or lack of sleep. But then, the shadow came back. This time, it wasn't subtle. It was in his apartment, a flicker in the corner of his living room that grew more solid each time he glanced at it. It didn't move like a person. It stretched and contracted, its edges blurring like ink spreading in water. Sam tried turning on every light in the apartment, but it didn't help. The shadow was still there, clinging to the corner like it belonged. And then it spoke. "Come," it whispered. Its voice like whined through cracked windows. "Find the door." Sam froze. "What door?" he asked, his voice trembling. But the shadow didn't answer. It simply faded away, leaving the air heavy with its presence. That night, Sam dreamed of the maze. He was walking through its corridors, his footsteps echoing endlessly, the walls impossibly high. Doors appeared at random intervals, each one slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of strange worlds. A city submerged in water, a forest where the trees glowed faintly, a room filled with mirrors reflecting things that weren't there. In the dream, he was always searching, though he didn't know what for. And always, he felt the shadow following him, just out of sight. When he woke, the maze from his dream was etched into the ceiling above his bed. The lines were faint, like chalk drawings, but unmistakable. Sam stared at it, his heart pounding. This wasn't normal. This wasn't possible. The shadow began appearing more frequently after that. It followed him to the grocery store, to the park, even to Larkspur Coffee. It didn't always speak, but when it did, it said the same thing: find the door. Sam started to wonder if he was losing his mind. He told Danny about it one day, half joking, hoping for reassurance. "That's weird," she said, frowning. "You're not the first person to mention something like that." "What do you mean?" Sam asked, his stomach dropping. Danny hesitated, then leaned in closer. "A guy who used to come here, Elliot. He was an artist like you. One day, he started talking about shadows and doors and a maze, I think. A couple weeks later, he disappeared, left all his stuff behind, even his sketchbooks." Sam felt a chill run down his spine. What happened to him? Danny shrugged. "No one knows. It's like he just vanished." That night, Sam decided he couldn't ignore it anymore. If the shadow wanted him to find the door, then he'd find it, if only to make it stop. He opened his notebook and began sketching the maze, letting his hand move without thinking. The lines seemed to guide themselves, forming patterns and pathways he didn't fully understand. When the drawing was complete, he felt a strange pull, like gravity but sideways. The shadow appeared, larger and more defined than ever before. Its voice filled the room. "You found it." The wall behind him split open, revealing a doorway. Beyond it was darkness, but not the kind that frightened him. This darkness felt alive, beckoning. Sam hesitated. He thought of Elliot, of the maze, of the strange worlds he'd glimpsed in his dreams. He thought of the life he'd been living, a life of routines and half-fulfilled ambitions, and realized he was more curious than afraid. He stepped through the door. The first thing he noticed was the air. It hummed, filled with a low, resonant energy. The second was the maze. It was real, stretching endlessly in every direction, just as he'd drawn it. And then there was the shadow, no longer a flicker but a towering figure made of smoke and stars. "Why me?" Sam asked. The shadow didn't answer, but he felt its meaning, as though it had pressed the answer directly into his mind. "Because you were willing to see." The maze shifted around him, its walls rearranging like a living puzzle. Sam took a step forward, then another. Somewhere deep within, he knew the truth was waiting. "I wasn't trying to ruin anyone's plans. I swear. It just sort of happened." The annual camping trip was coming up, and everyone was gearing up for the usual. 3 days of mosquitoes, overcooked hot dogs, and the unrelenting smell of campfire smoke that clings to your clothes for weeks. And don't even get me started on the sleeping arrangements. 7 people crammed into tents meant for 3. It's a tradition, sure, but it's the kind of tradition that makes you wonder why anyone ever romanticized the great outdoors in the first place. I knew better than to say anything outright. My family takes the trip seriously, like some kind of sacred pilgrimage. Uncle Ray's been hauling the same rusted-out canoe to the lake for 15 years, and my cousin Emma always insists on making her famous trail mix, which is really just stale granola with way too many raisins. The rest of them? Hardcore nature enthusiasts. Me? Not so much. I'd been secretly dreading the trip for weeks when, purely by chance, I stumbled across an ad for something called the Wilderness Experience. It was marketed as an upscale version of camping. Private cabins nestled in the forest, gourmet meals cooked by professional chefs, hot tubs under the stars, and activities like wine tastings and yoga classes instead of fishing or whatever Uncle Ray did with his canoe. It seemed perfect. A way to keep the spirit of the trip alive while skipping the worst parts. I clicked through the photos of smiling couples and friends sipping cocktails on their cabin decks. It didn't look like camping, not really, but who was I to argue with air conditioning and a real bed? I booked it on a whim, figuring I'd explain later. To make it work, I had to bend the truth just a little. Okay, a lot. I told everyone there was a mix-up at the usual campground, something about maintenance and a seasonal delay. It was a flimsy excuse, but no one questioned it. Then, I spun the new destination as a lucky break. A forest retreat, recommended by a friend, still rustic but with a few modern comforts. I assured them it was the perfect compromise. No one seemed particularly thrilled about the change, but they went along with it. Even Uncle Ray, who grumbled something about missing the point of camping, didn't put up much of a fight. I thought I was in the clear. What I didn't account for was the fact that my family is, to put it kindly, allergic to luxury. The problem started the moment we arrived. The cabins were more like boutique hotel suites, complete with king-sized beds, rainfall showers, and those pretentious little soaps that smell like lavender and regret. My mom stood in the middle of the room, staring at the flat-screen TV mounted above the fireplace like it was an alien artifact. "This doesn't feel very outdoorsy," she said, running a finger over the marble countertop in the kitchenette. Uncle Ray, meanwhile, had already begun unpacking his camping stove, only to freeze when he noticed the fully stocked kitchen. "Where's the fire pit?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. "How am I supposed to cook my chili?" I tried to redirect. "We don't need a fire pit. There's a chef on site who makes incredible food. They're doing a farm-to-table dinner tonight. You'll love it." Ray squinted at me like I'd suggested eating tree bark. Farm-to-table? What the hell does that even mean? Emma was next to voice her concerns. She'd been in the middle of organizing her trail mix ingredients when she noticed the retreat's welcome gift, a wicker basket filled with artisan snacks, including a bag of what I can only describe as gourmet granola dust. "What am I supposed to do with this?" she asked, holding up the bag as if it might explode. "Where are the raisins?" I did my best to smooth things over. I pointed out the hot tubs, the hiking trails, the complimentary yoga mats, but it was clear my family wasn't buying it. Dinner that night only made things worse. The farm-to-table meal, which I thought was incredible, herb-crusted salmon, roasted vegetables, some kind of fancy dessert with caramelized pears, was met with a chorus of complaints. "Where's the chili?" Ray asked again, poking at his plate like he expected it to bite back. My dad, ever the diplomat, tried to bridge the gap by suggesting the salmon would taste better if it were grilled over a real fire. My mom didn't say much, but she gave me that look, the one that says, "We'll talk about this later." The next morning, I woke up to chaos. Uncle Ray had decided to reclaim the wilderness experience by setting up his camping stove on the cabin's front porch, despite the retreat's very clear, no open flames policy. Emma had staged a mini rebellion in the kitchen, scattering her homemade trail mix across the counter like some kind of culinary battle cry. And my dad? He disappeared into the woods with a fishing rod he'd found in the trunk of Ray's car, determined to prove you could still fish even if the lake wasn't stocked. By the time the retreat staff showed up to gently remind us of the rules, I could feel the cracks in my plan widening into full-blown chasms. My mom pulled me aside as the others bickered over breakfast. "What were you thinking?" she asked, her voice low but sharp. "This isn't us. You know that, right?" I tried to explain that I just wanted to do something different, something better. "I thought you'd all appreciate the change," I said, though even I didn't believe it anymore. "Better for who?" she asked, and then she walked away. The rest of the trip was a series of awkward compromises. Ray refused to eat anything he didn't cook himself, so the staff grudgingly allowed him to use his camping stove in a designated area, as long as it didn't disturb the other guests. Emma spent most of her time wandering the trails, muttering about how the granola dust had ruined everything. My dad caught one fish the entire weekend, which he insisted on grilling over Ray's stove in a triumphant display of stubbornness. And my mom? She just sat on the porch, knitting and watching the chaos unfold like it was some kind of twisted reality show. By the time we left, my family was more than ready to return to their beloved, mosquito-infested campground. As we loaded up the car, Uncle Ray gave me a long, appraising look. "You meant well," he said finally, "but next time, leave the fancy crap at home." The drive back was quieter than usual. No one said it outright, but I knew what they were thinking. I tried to turn our tradition into something it wasn't, and in the process, I'd almost lost the thing that made it special in the first place. Maybe it wasn't perfect, but it was ours. So, AITA? Underneath the city, past the tunnels of steel and concrete, was a room that didn't exist. It had no maps, no coordinates, and no explanation for why it was always exactly where it needed to be. Its walls glowed faintly, like moonlight trapped inside stone, and its air smelled of rain just before it falls. This room didn't belong to anyone. But once every decade, it called someone. The last time it called, it chose Juno. Juno was sitting at her kitchen table, staring at an empty coffee cup and wondering how her rent was going to manifest itself this month. The pile of bills loomed to her left. A half-finished crossword stared her down from the right. Then the knock came. She lived on the 3rd floor, and the sound was impossibly close, as if someone were rapping their knuckles against the air itself. She opened her door to find no one, only a single black key hanging midair. It was attached to nothing, spinning lazily as though the laws of gravity had taken the day off. Juno's first thought was that she was hallucinating, which wouldn't have been completely out of character. But when she reached out to touch it, the key felt cold and real. Her hand closed around it instinctively. The world rippled. For a single moment, everything, the walls, the air, even the distant honk of a taxi below, stretched like paint being dragged by an unseen hand. Then it snapped back, and the black key was gone. In its place, a whisper coiled in her ear. Underground. Follow the sound of something you've never heard before. Juno wasn't sure why she obeyed. It wasn't curiosity. It was something more primal, an ache in her chest that refused to go ignored. She grabbed her coat and left her apartment, walking without thinking. Down streets she didn't recognize, into subway stations she'd never used, past doors she swore weren't there yesterday. The sound, when she finally heard it, was like nothing else. Not a melody, not a hum, but a frequency that vibrated directly in her bones. At the end of her journey, she found the door. Heavy, rusted, ancient. The black key was back in her hand as though it had never left. It fit the lock perfectly. Inside was the room. At first, she thought it was empty, but then her eyes adjusted to the dim glow. The floor was marked with intricate patterns, circles within circles, connected by lines that didn't seem to have a beginning or end. In the center stood a pedestal, and on it, a bowl filled with liquid that shimmered like molten gold. As Juno stepped closer, the walls around her began to pulse. Words formed in the air, carved from light. Take and see. She didn't question it. She dipped her fingers into the liquid, and the world tilted on its axis. In an instant, she was everywhere. She saw rivers that flowed backward, stars that blinked in and out of existence like a slow heartbeat, forests that breathed as though alive. She saw herself too, fractured, multiplied, living 1,000 different lives all at once. In one, she was a soldier standing atop a mountain of ash. In another, a queen whose crown burned like fire. In yet another, she was a shadow, slipping unnoticed through worlds that weren't hers. And then she saw the others, the room's previous callers. They stood at the edges of her vision, their faces half hidden, their forms flickering as though caught between dimensions. They were watching her, waiting. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice echoing strangely. To pass the burden, they replied, not with words, but with a collective thought that pressed against her mind. She didn't understand, not fully, but she felt the weight of it, the enormity of what they were asking her to take on. The room wasn't just a place. It was a nexus, a tether holding the fabric of existence together. And the liquid in the bowl wasn't just gold. It was memory, time, power, responsibility. Every 10 years, it demanded a new keeper, someone to guard it, to ensure the patterns on the floor remained unbroken. "Why me?" she whispered. "Because you heard the sound." It wasn't an answer. It was an inevitability. When she opened her eyes again, the room was gone. She was standing in her kitchen, the black key nowhere to be seen. But she wasn't the same. The world felt sharper, heavier, like she could see every crack in reality if she squinted hard enough. The weight of the burden settled on her shoulders. She didn't know how she'd been chosen or why, but she understood one thing. The room would call again, long after she was gone, and whoever answered would stand where she had, looking into the bowl, wondering if they were ready to hold the threads of the universe. The room didn't care if they were. It only cared that they came. I always thought it was a metaphor, selling your soul. Turns out, it's more of a paperwork thing. I wasn't looking to sell mine. Not consciously. But desperation does funny things to a person. My car had just died. My rent was overdue, and my boss kept threatening layoffs. Every day felt like balancing on a tightrope made of dental floss. So when I saw the little wooden sign outside the dusty antique shop, "We buy anything, and no exceptions," I figured maybe they'd take some of the junk I had lying around. Maybe I'd get $50. Enough for gas, at least. The shop was crammed with oddities, the kind of place where time feels sticky and the air smells like damp books. A man was sitting behind the counter, sipping tea from a chipped porcelain cup. He looked ordinary enough. Late 50s, sweater vest, wire-rimmed glasses. Except his eyes were so pale they were almost colorless. "Looking to sell?" he asked, setting his tea down. "Yeah," I said, unzipping my backpack. I pulled out a few things. An old watch, a leather-bound journal with nothing in it, and a tarnished silver locket. My usual flea market haul. He didn't even glance at the items. Instead, he looked straight at me and smiled, a thin, knowing smile. "Oh no, no, not those. We're not a pawn shop, my friend. What we're interested in is intangible." I laughed, more out of confusion than anything. "Like what? Good vibes?" His smile widened. "Not quite. We specialize in buying things people think they can't part with. Dreams, memories, talents, futures, souls." I took a step back. "Right. Okay, this was a mistake." I'll make it quick," he interrupted, reaching beneath the counter and pulling out a single piece of paper. The edges were burnt, and the text shimmered faintly as though written in light. "All I need is your signature. One tiny thing in return, and you'll have everything you need. Enough money to pay your bills. Fix your car. Start fresh." I didn't believe him, but I didn't leave either. Something about his tone, his certainty, rooted me in place. "What's the catch?" I asked. "Just a fragment," he said. "A piece you won't miss. The smallest sliver of your soul. Barely noticeable. Define small." He gestured toward the page. At the bottom, there was a drawing of a soul. At least, I think that's what it was. It looked like a glowing orb, divided into neat segments like a pie chart. One tiny wedge was shaded gray, and next to it, in delicate script, was written, "Love for strawberries." "Strawberries?" I asked, frowning. "Yes," he said. "If you sign, you'll lose all affection for strawberries. They'll taste like sawdust to you. But in exchange, your financial troubles? Gone." It sounded stupid. Too stupid to be real. But when I thought about it, I realized I didn't even like strawberries all that much. Maybe I was allergic as a kid? Or maybe they were just too sour. Either way, it didn't feel like a big loss. "Fine," I said, grabbing the pen. "If this is some kind of scam." "I assure you, it's not," he said, his grin sharpening. I signed. The paper flashed, the ink sizzling for a moment, and then it vanished. The man slid a sleek black card across the counter. "Congratulations. Funds are already transferred. Enjoy your newfound freedom." I left the shop feeling uneasy, but when I checked my bank account, I nearly dropped my phone. He wasn't lying. There was enough money in there to cover everything. I fixed my car, paid my rent, even bought myself a decent meal. Life was good. For about a week. Then the cravings started. Not for strawberries, obviously, but for something else. It was subtle at first. I'd feel restless in the middle of the night, pacing my apartment like I'd forgotten something important. I started revisiting the antique shop, only to find it closed every time. The wooden sign was gone, and no one in the area seemed to remember it ever being there. One night, I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, the taste of burnt sugar in my mouth. That's when I realized the man hadn't just taken my love for strawberries. He'd taken the concept of strawberries from me entirely. I couldn't picture them, couldn't describe them. The word itself started to slip from my mind, leaving a jagged hole I couldn't fill. Worse, the cravings didn't stop. They grew. I started dreaming about fields of fruit, about flavors I couldn't name but desperately needed. In my waking hours, I found myself obsessing over other parts of my life. Did I like coffee? Did I really enjoy music? Or was that another piece of me the man had somehow claimed without asking? I tried to move on, but it became impossible. Every decision I made felt hollow, every joy muted. I started questioning whether my soul was really intact, or if I'd unknowingly signed away more than I thought. Was a fragment just the start? 3 weeks after the deal, I found another envelope in my mailbox. This one wasn't an invitation. It was a bill. Due immediately, 2% of your laughter. I stared at it, trembling. Beneath the text was a note, scrawled in looping handwriting. Don't delay, or penalties may apply. I thought about ignoring it, but when I tried to laugh at a dumb video online that evening, no sound came out. My chest felt tight, and I could feel that same gnawing emptiness where the strawberries used to be. The second time I went to the shop, I didn't have a choice. It was open again, of course, as though it had never been gone. The man greeted me like an old friend, and this time, the paperwork was thicker. A stack of documents filled with fragments of myself I'd never even considered. My talent for whistling, my favorite childhood memory, the feeling I got when I watched sunsets. I didn't sign up for this, I said, slamming the papers down on the counter. Didn't you? He replied, his pale eyes twinkling. You took the deal. You spent the money. And now, my friend, the debt is simply coming due. I wanted to argue, to run, but I couldn't. The weight of his gaze pinned me in place, and I realized that this wasn't a choice. Not anymore. The first fragment had been a crack in the dam. The rest was just waiting to follow. And as I signed away 2% of my laughter, I wondered how much longer it would take before there was nothing left of me at all. The city was alive, buzzing with the chaos of morning commuters. Steam hissed from underground vents, and a symphony of honks and tire screeches played its usual discordant tune. I was part of the orchestra, my car gliding through the streets, its engine humming like a cello string stretched too tight. The coffee in my travel mug sloshed dangerously as I braked hard, narrowly avoiding a jaywalker with the reflexes of a sloth. My mornings were always like this, rushed, tense, forgettable. At least, until today. It began with a shadow. Not just any shadow, but one that darted unnaturally between the cars around me. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a passing bird or a low-flying drone. But then it zipped closer, so fast I barely registered its shape. My stomach tightened as it hovered, just for a second, over my windshield. It wasn't a shadow at all. It was a person, a man, dressed in what could only be described as a futuristic jumpsuit, clung to the hood of my car. He was grinning like he'd won the lottery, and for a moment, I could do nothing but stare. His hair, a messy crown of silver, seemed to spark like static against the sunlight. Then, with a theatrical wave, he mouthed 3 words, "Follow the signs." My hands tightened on the wheel as my brain scrambled to catch up. The man flipped off the hood, landing effortlessly in the next lane. Before I could react, he dashed forward, weaving between vehicles as if gravity had no claim on him. And then he was gone. I should have called someone. The police, a therapist, maybe my mother. But instead, I stayed on the road, a strange pull guiding me forward. A billboard caught my eye as I passed under it, its letters rearranging themselves before my very eyes. Exit now for what you've lost. I nearly missed the turn, but instinct took over, and I swerved onto the off-ramp. The road ahead was unfamiliar, a single lane framed by towering trees that seemed to bend inward, forming an arch. The air grew colder as I drove, and the radio, which had been playing static since the encounter, crackled to life. "You're late," a voice said. It was the same voice I'd heard in my head during restless nights, whispering doubts I couldn't shake. "What the hell is this?" I muttered, glancing around for cameras or any sign this was a prank. But there was only the road, stretching endlessly ahead. The voice chuckled, low and knowing. "You don't remember, do you?" "Remember what?" I shot back, though I wasn't sure who I was talking to. "You've been here before. Every time you said, maybe tomorrow. Every time you promised yourself you'd chase something, someone, and didn't. This is where those promises went to die." My grip on the wheel tightened as the trees gave way to a vast clearing. It was filled with objects, things I recognized but couldn't quite place. A red bicycle missing its chain, a guitar with broken strings, a jar of marbles that glinted in the pale sunlight. And then, at the center of it all, was a desk. My desk. It wasn't just a desk, though. It was a shrine. Stacks of notebooks, Piles of unfinished manuscripts, sketches of ideas I'd abandoned, littered its surface. A chair waited behind it, empty but expectant. I parked the car and stepped out, the crunch of gravel underfoot sounding louder than it should. The air smelled faintly of ink and dust, a library long forgotten. The closer I got, the clearer it became. This was a museum of my failures, my could-have-beens, my almosts. "You could still sit," the voice said, softer now. "There's time." "No," I replied, though my feet itched to move closer. This is a trick." The shadow man appeared again, perched casually on the edge of the desk. "A trick," he echoed, his grin still firmly in place. "No, this is an opportunity." "For what?" "To finish something. To start something. To break the cycle." He gestured to the objects scattered around. "These aren't just things. They're pieces of you. Pieces you've left behind. Like breadcrumbs in a forest you've forgotten how to navigate." I wanted to argue, to deny it, but the weight of his words was undeniable. My chest tightened as I looked around, the sheer volume of abandoned dreams pressing against me like a storm cloud. "What happens if I don't?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man's grin faltered, just for a moment. "Then you stay on the loop. Same road, same choices, same regrets. Until there's nothing left of you to salvage." I looked at the desk, at the notebooks brimming with stories I'd once been desperate to tell. My hands itched to reach for them, but something held me back. Fear, maybe, or exhaustion. The man stood, his silver hair crackling like electricity. "You've already made your choice," he said, his voice tinged with something almost like pity. "The road will take you where it always does." He stepped back, dissolving into the haze. The clearing began to fade, the objects retreating into shadow as the air grew warmer. I found myself back in my car, the familiar hum of traffic returning as if nothing had happened. I made it to work, sat at my desk, and stared at the blinking cursor on my computer screen. The day moved on, ordinary and uneventful. But in the back of my mind, I saw the silver-haired man in the field of abandoned dreams. That night, for the first time in years, I pulled out an old notebook. I began to write. The piano in the corner hadn't been touched in years. Dust layered its keys, and the lid was stuck halfway open, like a yawn frozen in time. It stood there, a silent observer to the life that had unraveled around it. Lila sat cross-legged on the floor in front of it, a glass jar in her lap. Inside the jar, a moth fluttered aimlessly, its wings a pattern of deep indigo that shimmered when the light hit just right. The room was dim, lit only by a single string of fairy lights coiled haphazardly around a bookshelf. The space smelled faintly of lavender and something metallic, a scent she couldn't place but had learned not to question. Her grandmother had called it the tides of the soul, the thing that had made its home in their family. It skipped generations sometimes, choosing its hosts with the precision of an artist selecting the right hue for a masterpiece. Lila didn't feel like much of a masterpiece. She felt like one of those sketches on napkins, fleeting, imprecise, and easily thrown away. But the tides had chosen her all the same. The moth in the jar had been the first sign. She'd woken up one morning to find it sitting on her pillow, staring at her with eyes that weren't eyes. It didn't blink, didn't move, just waited until she reached for it. When her fingers brushed its wing, the world shifted, colors bending and breaking around her like glass shattering in slow motion. She hadn't screamed, though she probably should have. Instead, she had sat there, her breath caught in her chest, until everything snapped back into place. The moth had stayed with her since, refusing to leave no matter how many times she opened the window or placed it outside. And then the dreams had started. They weren't dreams in the traditional sense. They felt too real, too solid, like she was living someone else's memories. In one, she stood on the edge of a cliff, the ocean roaring below, salt stinging her skin as a storm approached. In another, she wandered through a marketplace where the vendors spoke a language that was both familiar and foreign, their words like music she almost recognized. Each dream left her with a feeling she couldn't shake, a sense that she was being prepared for something. Tonight, the moth had been restless, beating its wings against the glass as though it were trying to tell her something. Lila had picked it up, its tiny body vibrating against her palm, and placed it in the jar. Now, as she stared at it, she felt the pull again, the strange sensation of something pressing against her mind. Her grandmother had warned her about this. When the tides come, they don't ask for permission, she had said, her voice low and serious. They just take. The first wave hit her like a slap, a sudden rush of cold that started at her fingertips and spread through her veins. The room around her dimmed, the fairy lights flickering out as shadows crept in from the corners. Her breath hitched, and the jar slipped from her hands, hitting the floor with a dull thud. The moth escaped, its wings leaving trails of light as it flew to the piano. It landed on the highest key, its tiny legs tapping out a single, crystalline note that echoed in the silence. The room was gone now, replaced by a vast expanse of water that stretched infinitely in all directions. The surface shimmered, reflecting a sky that was neither day nor night, but some liminal space in between. Lila stood ankle-deep in the water, her reflection staring back at her with eyes that weren't hers. The reflection smiled, a slow, knowing curve of the lips that sent a shiver down her spine. "You came," it said, though its mouth didn't move. Its voice was inside her head, layered and fragmented, like 100 voices speaking at once. "I didn't have a choice," she replied, her own voice sounding small and hollow against the vastness around her. The reflection tilted its head, its movements unervingly fluid. "You always have a choice. That is the nature of the tides. They offer, and you decide whether to accept." "Accept what?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. She could feel it in the air, in the way the water rippled around her legs as though alive. "Everything," the reflection said simply. It stepped closer, and as it did, the water beneath its feet turned to glass, solid and unyielding. The memories, the weight, the knowledge of all that was and all that could be. You will become the vessel, the one who carries the tides forward. But it is not a burden you must bear if you do not wish to. Lila laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "You say that like I have a real choice. Like I can just walk away from this and go back to my life?" "You can," the reflection said, its voice softer now. "But the world will feel smaller. The colors dimmer. Once you've touched the tides, nothing will ever feel the same." She looked down at her hands, at the faint glow that now radiated from her skin. It was beautiful and terrifying, a reminder of how far she had already stepped into this strange new reality. The weight of the choice settled over her like a lead blanket. She didn't want this, didn't ask for it, but she couldn't deny the pull, the way her soul seemed to stretch toward the horizon, aching for something she couldn't name. "I don't know if I'm strong enough," she whispered. "You don't have to be," the reflection said. It reached out, its hand passing through the water to clasp hers. Its touch was warm, almost comforting. "The tides will strengthen you. They are not just a burden. They are also a gift." Lila closed her eyes, the air around her buzzing with energy. She thought of her grandmother, of the stories she used to tell, of the way her voice would tremble when she spoke of the choices she had made. This was the legacy she had inherited, the thread that connected her to something far larger than herself. When she opened her eyes, the reflection was gone, and the water around her began to rise. It swirled upward, wrapping around her like a cocoon, until she was enveloped in light. She felt herself being pulled, her body and mind stretching and twisting, until she was back in her apartment, sitting on the floor with the jar in her lap. The moth was gone, but the feeling remained, a quiet hum beneath her skin. She stood slowly, her body aching with a strange, satisfying fatigue. The piano in the corner was no longer silent. Its keys were glowing faintly, as though waiting for her to play. Lila walked to it, her fingers hovering over the keys. She didn't know the tune, but the melody came to her anyway, flowing from her hands like water. The notes filled the room, weaving a story she couldn't fully understand but felt deep in her bones. The tides had come, and she had answered. It started with a bird, specifically, a pigeon that flew straight into the middle of my team meeting and perched itself on the edge of my laptop. Normally, this would have been cause for shrieking, chaos, maybe even a break in the endless parade of spreadsheets. But this wasn't a normal pigeon. Its feathers shimmered with an iridescence that didn't look natural, blue that morphed to green, then purple, then gold, like it was made of liquid sunlight. Everyone else in the meeting froze, staring at it like it was an alien. I said, brilliant as always. The pigeon tilted its head, locked its beady eyes on me, and then dropped something onto my keyboard. A tiny scroll, no bigger than a fortune cookie slip, tied with a piece of glittering thread. Before I could react, it let out a chirp that sounded suspiciously like laughter, flapped its wings, and disappeared out the window. The room was silent. My coworkers looked at me, then at the scroll, then back at me. Is this normal for you? Carl from accounting asked cautiously. No, I replied, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. The scroll was absurdly small, but when I unrolled it, the writing inside expanded like ink spilling across a page. It wasn't even written in words, exactly, more like symbols and squiggles that seemed to rearrange themselves as I stared. Finally, they coalesced into something I could read. You have been chosen. The Queen needs you. Trust no one. It also had an address, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, and a time. 10:13 p.m. I should have thrown it away, or ignored it, or reported the possibly radioactive pigeon to someone in authority. But something about the note tugged at me, like a memory I couldn't quite place. Besides, my life had been aggressively boring for years. Same job, same commute, same lackluster dinners microwaved to perfection. So, against all logic, I found myself standing outside the warehouse that night, clutching a flashlight and questioning all my life choices. The door creaked open before I even touched it, and inside, the air smelled like damp concrete and something faintly floral. The flashlight beam danced across crates and dust motes, but there was no sign of life. Hello? I called, feeling ridiculous. A voice answered, rich and lilting. You're late. I whirled around to find a woman standing there, illuminated by what seemed like moonlight. But there were no windows. She was tall and impossibly elegant, dressed in a gown that seemed to be woven from actual starlight. Her hair cascaded in waves of silver, and her eyes were like the pigeon's feathers, shifting colors too fast to pin down. I said again, my brain apparently incapable of producing coherent thoughts in the presence of otherworldly beings. You're the one the bird chose? She asked, her tone skeptical. You're ordinary. Gee, thanks, I muttered, regaining a shred of dignity. Who are you? What is this? She ignored my questions and handed me a small box, no bigger than a jewelry case. This must be delivered to the Queen by sunrise, she said. No detours, no delays. And remember, trust no one. Before I could ask which queen or why a pigeon couldn't just deliver it, she disappeared into the shadows, leaving me holding the box like a particularly confusing hot potato. I should have left then. I really should have. But curiosity is a terrible thing, and I couldn't stop myself from cracking open the box just a little. Inside was nothing, just an empty, velvet-lined interior. I tilted it, shook it, even sniffed it, don't ask me why. But there was absolutely nothing there. Which, of course, is when things got weird. The box began to hum, a low vibration that sent shivers up my arms. A shadow detached itself from the corner of the room and slithered toward me. It wasn't a person or an animal, just a smear of darkness, like the absence of light had decided to go for a stroll. Hand it over, the shadow hissed, its voice like dry leaves scraping pavement. I clutched the box tighter. No thanks. The shadow lunged, but before it could reach me, the box emitted a blinding burst of light. The shadow screeched and evaporated like smoke, leaving me alone again, but not unscathed. My hands tingled where I'd held the box, and when I looked down, a strange mark had appeared on my palm. A swirling pattern that glowed faintly, like embers in a dying fire. By now, I'd realized 3 things. 1. This was way above my pay grade. 2. I was probably in mortal danger. 3. I really wanted to see how this played out. So, I ran. Out of the warehouse, down dark streets, clutching the box like it might explode. Along the way, more shadows appeared, slithering out of alleyways, lurking under streetlights. Every time they got close, the box's light drove them back, but it was getting weaker. By the time I reached the address scrawled on the original note, I was out of breath and out of patience. The Queen, as it turned out, was waiting for me in a dilapidated flower shop that smelled like roses and mildew. She wasn't what I expected. No starlight gowns or iridescent eyes. Just a tired-looking woman in jeans and a t-shirt, sipping tea from a chipped mug. "You're late," she said, echoing the first woman's words. "Yeah, well, I got attacked by shadows, so maybe cut me some slack," I snapped, slamming the box onto the counter. "What the hell is going on?" She opened the box, peered inside, and smiled. "Perfect," she said, as if it weren't completely empty. Before I could demand an explanation, the mark on my palm flared with heat. The Queen touched it gently, and for a brief moment, I saw everything. A world layered over ours, shimmering with impossible colors. Pigeons that weren't pigeons, shadows that weren't shadows, and a war I'd unwittingly stumbled into. When I came back to myself, the Queen was looking at me with something like pity. "You'll figure it out," she said cryptically, "if you survive." And just like that, I was back outside, holding an empty box and 1,000 questions. A pigeon cooed from a nearby rooftop, and I glared at it. AITA for answering the call? Or is this just my life now? For years, my cousin Ellis was the golden child of our family. You know the type. Effortlessly charming, devastatingly good-looking, and blessed with a streak of luck so absurd it felt like the universe had him on some secret payroll. Ellis didn't just walk into a room. He glided in like a movie star at a premiere, and everyone, even the cynics, wanted to know him. But beneath that golden veneer was a mess. Ellis was impulsive, perpetually broke, and had a knack for leaving chaos in his wake. Whether it was a trail of broken hearts or a string of abandoned jobs, he always seemed to shrug it off with a grin that said, "What can you do? That's life." Despite it all, I adored him. Growing up, he made me feel like a co-conspirator in some grand, adventurous scheme. We'd sneak out to watch late-night meteor showers, plan elaborate pranks on our siblings, and dream up businesses we'd definitely start someday. It was hard not to love someone who made the ordinary feel like magic. But as adults, our dynamic shifted. I became his safety net. When Ellis ran out of cash again, I'd be the one Venmoing him, just enough to get by until payday. When he got evicted from his latest apartment, I let him crash on my couch, even though he never pitched in for groceries or cleaned up after himself. Whenever his whirlwind romances imploded, I was the one picking him up, listening to him moan about how women just don't appreciate a free spirit. I told myself it was temporary, that he'd find his footing eventually. But temporary stretched into years, and with each new crisis, my patience wore thinner. The breaking point came last summer. My band was set to play our first big gig at a local festival, something I'd been working toward for years. I'd poured every spare second into rehearsals, marketing, and making sure everything was perfect. It wasn't just a show. It was a chance to prove I could make music my career. Ellis, of course, decided to visit that weekend. "Just passing through," he said casually, showing up on my doorstep with a duffel bag slung over one shoulder. "Thought I'd see my favorite cousin and catch your show. Hope that's cool?" I should have said no. My place was tiny, I was stressed beyond belief, and I knew. Ellis couldn't help but make himself the center of attention, but I caved. That night, he came to rehearsal and immediately charmed my bandmates, cracking jokes and telling wild stories about his road trip. I caught him in the corner teaching our drummer how to do card tricks, and for a moment, I let myself believe it would be fine. It wasn't. On the day of the festival, Ellis managed to lock himself out of my apartment while I was at soundcheck. Instead of calling me or waiting for me to get home, he decided to solve the problem by climbing through my bathroom window. In the process, he knocked over a shelf of ceramic mugs I'd been collecting for years. By the time I got back, there were shards of pottery everywhere, and Ellis sitting sheepishly on the couch with a towel wrapped around his bleeding hand. "Bad news," he said, grinning like a kid who'd just drawn on the walls with crayon. Your mugs didn't make it. My jaw dropped. Ellis, are you serious? Why didn't you just wait? Or call me? I didn't want to bother you, he said, as if his solution had been the most logical thing in the world. But hey, at least I'm okay, right? I lost it. This isn't cute, Ellis. This isn't charming. You've been screwing up my life for years, and I've let you because I thought one day you'd grow up. But you're still the same selfish, reckless idiot you've always been, and I can't do this anymore. His smile faltered. Whoa, okay, he said, holding up his hands. Where is this coming from? I'm sorry about the mugs, but you're acting like I set your house on fire or something. It's not just the mugs. I snapped. It's everything. It's always everything with you. Every time I let you in, you find a way to make it all about you. And I'm done. The words hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. Ellis stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he stood, grabbed his duffel bag, and slung it over his shoulder. Fine, he said quietly. If that's how you feel, I'll get out of your way. He left without another word. The festival went on, but I couldn't enjoy it. My band played great, and people loved our set, but all I could think about was whether I'd been too harsh. Ellis wasn't a bad person, just a chaotic one. Maybe I should have handled it differently. But then I remembered the years of exhaustion, the constant sacrifices, the way my life bent and warped around his needs. And for the first time, I realized something. I didn't owe him my patience. Still, as the weeks passed without so much as a text from Ellis, doubt crept in. Was I wrong to kick him out? Could I have set boundaries without pushing him away completely? AITA,